graphics of showing spacecraft flying around the universe propelled by this awesomely powerful rocket engine. Those graphics were of course made using the game Kerbal Space Program, but with a mod called Far Future Technologies. So Kerbal Space Program has a sequel in the pipeline. It was originally supposed to be released in 2020, but it's been since pushed back to 2022. One of the big upgrades the sequel's supposed to have is a whole bunch of future technology rocket designs, all based on real concepts. But you can play with all these concepts now thanks to Far Future Technologies, which is a free mod developed by a fan called Nerty. It brings all of the same ideas with grounding in real physics and brings them into the game engine so you can fly around and simulate them. So this was the X-2 Heinlein nuclear saltwater rocket. It is one of many parts. And so I thought it would actually be good to go through this and give a quick overview of how all the different engines are supposed to work, because they're all based on real physics concept. I'd love to do a deep dive on more of these, but we're going to start out with the first one on the page. It's the Impulse Magneto-Inertial Fusion Drive, and it's based on a real NASA concept. Now, it says magneto-inertial fusion. There's generally two types of fusion that are discussed, magnetic confinement and inertial confinement, and this one does a little bit of both. The way it's supposed to work is the fusion fuel is compressed down with a foil which is manipulated with magnetic fields. Specifically, it uses lithium foil because lithium, when it's bombarded with neutrons, will produce things like tritium and helium-3, which will enhance your fusion yield. And also, handling lithium foil is a lot easier than handling tritium. Now, the important measure of success with fusion drives is the gain factor, how much extra energy you get out from the fusion compared to the energy that you put into making the fusion start. So they calculate they need a gain factor of about 200, and to get the performance they would need for a 7-month Mars mission, they would need something like 400 kilowatts of solar panels to power this drive system. So I mean, it would obviously be revolutionary. In fact, any of the drives covered in this little episode would be revolutionary. So let's go to the next one. The Discovery Spherical Tokamak Fusion Engine. So this is actually based on a hypothetical engine from a NASA study looking at a crewed mission to Saturn, right? So this is their Discovery 2 with a habitation module with rotation at the far end. And yeah, I think this is from 2001. Like, they're actually literally trying to do 2001. Now, the spherical tokamak part tells us that this is a magnetic confinement fusion system, which is basically where you try to compress and confine the plasma using magnetic fields. It sounds easy enough, but in practice, apparently it's like trying to sculpt a piece of jelly into a useful shape using only rubber bands. When you start to try to apply real pressure, the contents have a habit of leaking out and messing up your lines of force. But one of the sort of core things you find in plasma research is the tokamak, which is something which holds a plasma in a magnetic field that is shaped like a donut. So a spherical tokamak is where you kind of take the donut and you squish it, so the hole in the middle of the donut is as thin as possible, like a big vertical cylinder, and you squeeze it into a spherical shape. So the idea, I guess, with these engines is that you have a reaction chamber where you've got a confined plasma, you've got fusion happening, and then you allow it to leak out as a rocket exhaust. So your energy is coming from the fusion and your exhaust is coming from the plasma that is being heated up and leaking out. So the mirror cell fusion engine uses the same magnetic confinement system, but instead of it being in a donut shape, they just have it in a long, thin chamber. In the mod, you can actually have the chambers be very long, like 45 meters long, and you have a magnetic mirror at each end to kind of confine the plasma and stop it leaking out the ends, except that you make it the geometry subtly different on one end so that it can leak out and provide you thrust. Now, in this case, we actually have another advantage where you can use the heat and that plasma to heat regular liquid hydrogen, the boring old hydrogen that doesn't really undergo fusion unless it's in the middle of a star. So by doing this, you're dumping extra mass into the exhaust and it's getting heated up, so you get much higher thrusts at the expense of lower specific impulse. Now we have the hammer-tong inertial confinement fusion engine. So inertial confinement doesn't use magnetic fields. What it does is it tries to squeeze it, and how it squeezes it using a bunch of lasers. So this drive, in terms of game technology, it produces these little fusion pulses which are triggered by a lot of lasers being fired at a tiny pellet. And you can actually see the lasers in the model focusing on the pellet, causing it to explode. Now, to actually make fusion happen, you have to compress it and heat it up. And you can see that with lasers, it's very easy to heat things up. But how do they compress it? Well, the surface layers of that pellet boil off and evaporate, and it's like the impulse from a rocket blowing off and squeezing the pellet down, causing the explosion. This is something that is actually done for real. There's the National Ignition Facility, which is close to me in California, where they have a giant building where they do this exact thing. I mean, they don't fly the building around, they just have a giant building where they cause tiny pellets of nuclear material to explode. And the reason they do this is so they can study the behavior of thermonuclear weapons without actually detonating a real thermonuclear weapon. That's why the test ban treaty is actually a very good thing for the US. So now we have the axial flow Z-pinch fusion torch engine. The Z is for zeta. It basically implies a mechanism where you flow electricity